Yeah, archiving started, Tim.
Thanks, David. And thanks, everyone, for your patience this evening. And I say this evening advisedly. It's 7:30 here in Eastern Standard Time. Some of you, of course, are joining us on the west coast of North America, where it's late afternoon, and some of you are joining us from points beyond. And in particular, so too are this evening's wonderful presenters David's voice of which you just heard a moment ago, and you've probably heard from Fumiyo Kagawa as well. They, as you may have already heard, are joining us from southwest England, and I'm very pleased to have them here as presenters for this evening. I will introduce them formally in a moment, but just to say that it's funny how we were just chatting and everything, all systems go about 20 minutes ago. And somehow, just as we were getting ready to start, the system kicked me out, and for reasons unbeknownst to me. So I do appreciate your patience, and thank you, David and Fumiyo, for jumping in with engaging those who've joined us so far. Let me just, to everyone who's joined us, some of you I recognize as people who've been on previous webinars. So I will just give a very brief overview for those of you who've not. This is your first webinar, essentially to give you an idea of where we're going for the next hour. David and Fumiyo are going to share a headset passing back and forth in a wonderful presentation I had a taste of just the other day when we did a practice session. They'll speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we're going to turn it over to you for questions. But as you can see from your many responses already in the chat box in the bottom left-hand corner, you don't have to wait to ask questions. If there's if something that they say that you want to make a comment on, or if you're having any technical difficulties, I don't know if I'm going to be able to solve them tonight, but if you have technical difficulties, you have a question, or you want to ask, a comment of any other participant, don't hesitate to make use of the chat box in the meantime. And if you're not familiar with Green Teacher, we are a magazine, a nonprofit magazine we've been publishing for the last 20 years. Some of you may be familiar with us. Here's a slide of a few recent covers. And David and Fumiyo, in fact, wrote a wonderful cover article on climate change education that really inspired this webinar that was in our fall issue of fall 2011, accompanied by 5 very dynamic and engaging activities for youth educators. If you've not seen Green Teacher, or you've not seen a copy of our books, I'd encourage you to go to the Green Teacher website afterwards. We are a non-profitable nonprofit, as I often say. And if you find this to be a worthwhile webinar, I'd strongly encourage you to take out a subscription, buy a book, whatever, that will enable us to continue offering this series of free webinars. Now, without further ado, and I did mention earlier, I think, to a couple of you who asked in the chat box, we are going to be archiving, as you heard, that we turned on the archive a few minutes ago, so that if you have friends that you think would enjoy seeing this or listening to this webinar and viewing the slides, let them know that they can freely do that anytime in the next 30 days. After that, one has to be a subscriber to view it. So you don't need to take notes, and you yourself can view the archive version as of tomorrow afternoon. Now, without further ado, let me introduce our 2 presenters. David and Fumiyo, of course, have contributed to Green Teacher just recently. David is the founding director, and Fumiyo is the research director of a new nonprofit international organization called Sustainability Frontiers, currently with offices in both the UK and in Canada. You can learn more about them at sustainabilityfrontiers.org. They're also the editors of Education and Climate Change, Living and Learning in Interesting Times, that was published 2 years ago by Routledge. They've been heavily involved with UNESCO and UNICEF in developing climate change education program materials. More recently, they did a survey or a mapping survey for those two organizations of disaster risk reduction school curricula, because that focus is becoming an important one, and you'll hear David and Fumiyo address that this evening. And they're currently, what I was particularly excited, David and Fumiyo, to hear that you're putting together a teacher handbook on climate change education. And for those of you in this webinar, you can't wait to see, as I can't, to see a copy of that book. I'm happy to report that David and Fumiyo are hosting a summer institute in Sidmouth, the town in Devon in which they live in southwest England, sometime this summer. And I'll be sending out details to all of you and everyone else who registered for this evening's session sometime tomorrow. So again, you'll have all of that, all their contact information and follow-up details. So without further ado, please join me in a warm welcome for David and Fumiyo, and over to you two.
Thanks very much, Tim. Hi, everybody. Just to say, too, I noticed that Bert Talks Online from Nova Scotia, there are plans for Sustainability Frontiers Canada to also run a summer institute. They're kind of on the drawing board, but Bert at some stage would be able to share details of that with folk if it really materializes. But thank you, Tim, and greetings, everyone. My name's David Selby, and just to pass over to Fumiyo so she can say hi.
Hello, everyone. This is Fumiyo speaking.
Great, thank you, Fumiyo. And we'll go into our presentation. It's a new experience for us, this. We've never facilitated a webinar before. Our usual teaching and learning medium is an interactive workshop setting. We tend to go in for that kind of face-to-face interactive approach more often. It's also highly unusual in that this is the first time we've ever been teaching in the early hours of the morning. Quite a new experience. There was plenty of coffee being drunk here a short while ago. How do we intend to run the next half hour? Well, we'll both contribute, moving backwards and forwards between us, me introducing the ideas and Fumiyo describing learning activities that, as we see it, exemplify deep climate change education. They're activities that we have recently developed for UNESCO in each case. Please excuse a delay as we do a switch over, in that we've got one headset between us and we'll have to move the headset to a different pair of ears. So there'll be a slight delay each time. Please go with that if you would. As I mentioned to folk while we were waiting for Tim to reconnect, it would be great if participants could share some local issue, concern or experience of climate change, writing a few words in the box and let that roll over the next 10, 15, 20 minutes. It'll be exciting to see what comes in, and it kind of will enrich the whole webinar process. That would be really great. So do write something about some local concern or experience. Put your name will appear, of course, but if you can tell us where you're located too, so we'll have a sense of the spatial spread, if you like, of the community we have tonight. Okay, if we can move on to the next slide. I want to start by giving sort of affirming where we stand. We start from a platform of saying that climate change is very real and, for the most part, human-induced. The University of California's Naomi Oreskes did a survey just a few years ago of 928 peer-reviewed articles on climate change published between 1993 and 2003. She didn't find one in the 928 of those peer-reviewed articles that disputed the fact that humans are causing climate change. This first slide gives the opinion of leading scientists from around the world, British, American, and German. and all of them pretty much confirming the causality of climate change. It's commonly said by the UN and by governments that we can live with a 2-degree surface temperature rise relative to pre-industrial levels. And that is, of course, a view that is called economically acceptable, and that it won't shock the global economy too much. But these scientists that you have on this slide and others, plenty of others, are saying that we're going to find it really hard, almost impossible, to hold to a 2-degree centigrade rise above pre-industrial levels. And some of them, especially James Hansen from NASA, in his book Storms of My Grandchildren, makes the clear case that a 2-degree centigrade rise anyway would be a disaster scenario for the world. And it may be too late to prevent climate tipping points kicking in. What was in the 1990s into early this century seen as a process of gradual incremental global warming is now being seen as likely to be abrupt with sudden lurches, and we prefer to use the term global heating to convey a less comfortable notion, a less incremental notion, something sudden and dangerous. This is a little story, a Sufi story that we put in our article, and we think it's important enough to merit inclusion again, even though some of you will perhaps become familiar with it now. It really sets where we want to go. He was found to be looking for it under a light. He looked and looked and couldn't find it, this lost key. Finally, someone asked where he had lost the key. He answered, "Well, I did in fact lose it over there." And when asked why he didn't look for it over there, he said, "Well, it's dark over there, but there is light here for me to look." And that to us has become a parable of kind of what is wrong, by and large, with mainstream climate change. We tend, as per the parable, to be looking in well-lit places, and we see this as the characteristic of mainstream climate change. Looking in the light or the comfortable places, the whole field of climate change has predominantly been taken up by science and technology. It's full of technical fixed notions, and underpinning the whole thing is the notion that there can be, with due scientific and technological effort, there can be business as usual. And the search in the light, where it's comfortable, has stopped us looking in the dark places, which are distinctly uncomfortable for human beings and human society. An exploration of ethics and values is missing from most climate change curricula. Climate change is viewed as at root a CO2 problem and greenhouse gas problem, and rather than a manifestation of the crisis of the direction in human society globally. There's an ill-preparedness to look at the whole pathological faith in or fetish of economic growth. It's beyond the pale to trespass into critical learning about growth. Dystopian futures are very rarely part of the climate change scenario because of the ever-present myth of ever upward progress within our society. So we see that looking in the well-lit places may be comfortable, but we avoid the uncomfortable, the dark places, where in our view the education really ought to also be if we are to have an educational combating of climate change. So let's share an idea from outside the well-lit comfort zone.
Okay, so this is the first activity example. As just mentioned by David, one of the characteristics of mainstream climate change education is its failure to examine current personal and societal impact, as well as future implications of climate change. So using stories is an excellent way forward to consider real impact of climate change on people's lives. You are now looking at one example, the beginning of a story of a farmer in South Africa. So teacher can collect a few different stories from around the world and give one story per small group of students, then ask each group member to quietly read the given story. Then ask a group to discuss and list the effect of climate change they see in the story, feeling they experienced on reading the story, and their ideas on what individuals and nations should do. So you can use chat like this. In a plenary session, ask each group to summarize the story they have read before sharing ideas from their own chats.
An activity like climate change stories takes us into real people's lives, in which the learner begins to understand the tragic impacts of climate change that are already upon us. We're not talking the future here, but the stories reveal too profound ethical issues, issues of justice, deep-rooted causes, as well as exacerbating factors, and they reveal very strongly the disproportional impacts around the world of climate change that a fixation on science and technology, as we see it, cannot address on their own. And so we're offering here on this slide two forms of climate change education. Like all models of this kind, you could ultimately drive a bus. Life is a lot more varied and nuanced than this, but we're arguing that there is something roughly that we can call shallow climate change education, directed at the immediate presenting level, an emphasis on science and technology. It deals with mitigating the presenting greenhouse gas causes by an emphasis on alternative energy, for instance. It's concerned with technological adaptation, for instance, the building of seawalls, work against landslips and whatever. But essentially, it's shallow. It's not dealing with the fundamental driving forces behind climate change. Deep climate change education, while accommodating science and technology, addresses the fundamental systemic driving forces. And this is all finally, we think, a matter of hope. What are we concerned about here? Hope is important for human life springs and society, but is our climate change overly directed to a kind of or authentic hope, what we refer to in the article as spurious optimism, finding hope in a comfortable place, or is the hope we're after authentically grounded, hard-edged in the dark corners of the real threats that we do face in the 21st century? So coming to the beginning, a brief explanation of deep climate change education as we see it, we first say that there must be a much greater and clearer and thoroughgoing engagement with the despair, pain, grief and loss at a whole variety of levels that climate change involves. An engagement with what is being lost, what is likely to be lost, with hope, with fears, with dystopian future scenarios, which in our view, if sensitively facilitated, can lead to new vision, new resolve, and to individual and collective action of the blessed unrest kind we speak of in the article. Clive Hamilton, the Australian writer, has talked about the need for a new approach, a process of despair, of accepting, of acting. And this is why in our article we offer a despair and empowerment activity following Joanna Macy's wonderful work. Let's work genuinely and authentically through despair. Let's accept our situation and let's rebuild anew as a platform for action. An activity like climate change picture gallery can be part of such a despair, accept and act process towards empowerment. Fumiyo.
Okay. So addressing climate change despair, grief, or cynicism among students is indeed a challenging task for educators. We think one way forward is to use pictures as stimulus materials. So hang a number of climate change-related photographs on the wall around the classroom. You are looking at one of the examples. Ask students to form pairs and to go on a tour around the picture gallery. The team will discuss each photograph in terms of its message and its implications. Students also share their own emotional response to what they see. During the gallery tour, each pair will choose photographs according to some criteria. For instance, a picture which makes them feel most helpless, the one that makes them most angry, the one that makes them most concerned for the future, the one that makes them feel most motivated to do something about climate change. Then, at the whole class debriefing, explore choice of pairs made according to the criteria.
Yeah, under this first heading of and looking into the dark corners, we argue that there's a huge amount of denial and self-delusion around climate change, especially in the affluent north of the planet. We find it less in Africa, for instance, except amongst the elites in Africa. And we think that it's a vital part of a climate change learning process to have students confront and become agents in confronting denial. Cognitive dissonance is clearly around. This means, it's a psychological term, but means the holding of two contradictory mental and emotional positions simultaneously. When we know that what we are saying or how we are behaving is contradicted by evidence or by other opinions we hold at the same time. So we're kind of pulled in a couple of directions at once. Chamberlain's trip to Munich before World War II comes to mind in this regard. He went to Munich in 1938 to meet Hitler. Everybody knew what Hitler was like. Chamberlain came back with a worthless agreement for peace. Everybody cheered. People loved Munich. They desperately wanted to believe that peace was possible, precisely because it was obvious that it wasn't possible. We are reacting to climate change like that. There is what Charles Tart, a writer in this area, has called consensus trance reality. We live consensually in a trance, societally, consensually in a trance about climate change. And James Henson, the NASA scientist, has talked about dangerous reticence on a grand scale. Our argument is that education has a central part to play in addressing climate change self-delusion and hypocrisy. Examples all over the place. Our erstwhile Prime Minister Tony Blair declaring himself a world leader on climate change before he jetted off in a private jet halfway around the world. And we say that in all of this, students can take a leadership role.
A library way to address climate change denial is to use snappy or short dramas. which are quickly prepared and then to be immediately performed in response to stimulus scenarios. You now see one example on the slide. So in this story, students confront hypocrisy of the newspaper. So ask the student form a small group, then explain that they will be given a series of cards, each one offering an example of climate change denial. Then hand out the first card and tell group members that they are to decide on roles and prepare a 1-minute drama where some in the group try to confront the denial of other individuals in the group. Give, say, about a few minutes of preparation time. Then choose a few groups to perform their drama. Once the performance complete, hand out the second card, repeating the process 4 or 5 times in all. After the performances, have the class tease out issues. We think this activity gives a good practice in confronting denial.
A second aspect of our looking into the dark corners concerns the global growth economy. As Charles Harrison has said, I think we're suffering, and we think we're suffering an economic growth fetishism. The fetishism meaning imbuing something with a quasi-religious power. Political leadership around the world sees growth as providing the answer to every problem. Growth will save the poor. If inequality is the problem, then a rising tide will raise all boats. Growth will solve unemployment, give us better schools. If the environment's in trouble, more growth will fix it. There is what Bob Lloyd, an Australian writer, has called the growth delusion, an irrational insistence on growth as non-negotiable. There's no viable alternative. Growth, although we speak about an open curriculum and multiplicity of views, is rarely examined in school curricula. Schools, we argue, often collude with the growth agenda. ESD, Education for Sustainable Development, is very growth-orientated in many manifestations. And yet, growth, unmitigated global growth, is solidly behind climate change. It's solidly behind the destruction of the ecosphere, the destruction of the cultural or ethnosphere. We need to remind ourselves through our education that we live on a planet, not in a marketplace. Consumerism has become, as part of this whole growth syndrome, consumerism has become key to identity for many. Our identity needing regular purchasing replenishment. And we get fed up with what we've bought, we need to buy more. And the growth model depends on a base of continuing or replenished unhappiness as well as happiness. And we argue that part of effective climate change education is what we call anti-consumerism education, in which we unpack what consumerism is doing to the environment, to social justice, and to the very identity of human beings, a reduced sense of inauthentic and also inauthentic identity coming from consumerism. We need education in slowing growth, slow growth or no growth alternatives.
In this activity, ask students to form a pair and give each a cut-up set of climate change mitigation strategies. Now you see 3 examples addressing growth economy and consumerism. Give a long strip of paper to each pair and then ask them to draw a line and assign one criterion from the list. For instance, these are the examples. The teacher should make sure that the set of criteria are equally distributed among the pairs. Each pair will discuss and agree where to position the strategies. Have them stick the strategy along the line. Once the task is complete, ask each pair to get together with other pairs, worked with a different strategy. Each pair in the group explain and justify their positioning decisions to others. This then invite the group to discuss how and why the criteria they worked with influence their positioning of strategies. Finally, in the whole class discussion, tease out feedback and issues.
Yeah. A third aspect of our platform for deep climate change education concerns reversing the predominating nature's resource paradigm, a re-embracing of intimacy with an involvement in nature, an intrinsic valuing of nature, what we called in the article the need to cultivate the poetic and the spiritual. We feel this is hugely important, a reassertion of poetic and spiritual ways of knowing, to reconnect folk to the world. We see in what is going on in the processes, in social and globalization processes, essentially a desiccation of the psyche in tandem with the destruction of the planet. So a reassertion of the poetic aspect, the numinous aspect of being human, if you like, is clearly important to us. But we know this is very well known to readers of Green Teacher. As one way of looking at that is to think of T.S. Eliot's remark that with the 17th century science, we began as human beings in the West to experience a disassociation of sensibility from the natural world around us. Alistair McIntosh has talked about the mindlessness that underlines anthropogenic climate change, human-induced climate change, and argues that we need to feel more about the world yet again. Looking in the dark corners further, we'd like to advance again, as we did in the article, the notion of denizenship. Living in a place, building place-rooted democracy in that place, rather than the kind of arm's-length citizenship democracy that we have at the moment. And that democracy grounded in an immediate experience of the human and the other than human, of the nature-culture relationship, what Vandana Shiva has called a local living democracy. We feel that this could be practiced from within a localized school curriculum. So very much an emphasis on the human being as denizen of place. But there's some need in becoming denizens to be wary of an inward-looking tendency. There's a very strong need too, within a process of localization, to also engage in cosmopolitan dialogue and have learners engage in cosmopolitan dialogue, concern, and solidarity through the multiple media now available. Deep climate change education really does call for climate justice and climate injustice issues to be addressed. We have a deeply unjust world in terms of climate change at the moment. The effects of climate change are falling on those in the developing world who least caused it, leading to cause for restorative justice. We have to recognize the ecological indebtedness of the rich countries for the global atmospheric commons. And we have to think too of the massive environmental migrations that are going to happen because of climate change, and the importance of preparing students for kindness to the climate change migrant.
So in addressing the issue of climate change justice, teachers can use cartoons. Each group will be given one criteria to rank them. Criteria could include shocking, disturbing, sad, perceptive, or thought-provoking, funny, puzzling. For instance, one group will rank the 10 cartoons from most shocking to least shocking. In the whole class discussion, ask student group to report back on their ranking and the thinking behind their ranking before engaging them in discussion of issues that have surfaced.
Deep climate change education, in our view, also asks for climate change learning to be integrated with disaster risk reduction education and sustainability education. As Tim mentioned, Sustainability Frontiers is working a lot on all of these three educations for UNESCO and for UNICEF. And out of that work, we've come up with the following model, which is something that UNESCO and UNICEF are now working with, in which we see climate change education, sustainability education, and disaster risk reduction as very much overlapping circles. A sustainable future is quite impossible without addressing climate change. So education for sustainability must address the realities of climate change if it is to avoid fostering inauthentic hope for a sustainable future. Likewise, education for sustainability needs to address the mushrooming acceleration in the incidence and severity of disasters globally, many of which are climate change exacerbated. And whereas before there was a tendency in the rich north of our planet to talk about disaster being kind of out there, not affecting us, we see it coming closer and closer to our doors. In 2011, the New Zealand earthquake, the Japanese nuclear and tsunami and earthquake disaster, what happened in the US last week as a result of tornadoes and weather events, it is coming closer, and this severity is being exacerbated by climate change. So we would argue for the bringing of disaster risk reduction education with all the emphasis on disaster adaptation to possible disaster and mitigation of potential hazards leading to disasters as part of the school curriculum. We've started now just some new work in Vanuatu in the Pacific in developing their climate change education and disaster risk reduction education according to this model.
Okay, so there are so-called mapping activities widely used around the world. So ask students to form a small group and to draw a school map or community map by marking up the areas where natural hazards, flood, cyclones, landslides, wildfires, drought, etc. have affected before, the area that might be vulnerable to potential future natural hazards. Maps can also include available resources and also safe areas. Students draw maps using their own memories, but maps can be developed through research. For instance, students can have a field observations and conduct interviews with some key school and community members. Further to the mapping exercise, encourage students to disseminate the hazard and climate change risk messages using creative media. In some countries, for instance, students have used street theater, puppet shows, radio program, and posters. Those activities themselves illustrative of democratic education for citizenship, which David has explained earlier.
Well, thank you for listening to us. Please do visit our website if you like. On our website, you can find details of how to become a friend of Sustainability Frontiers, and you would receive postings, including these activities we've placed before you tonight. They'll very shortly be on the UNESCO website, and anybody can then enter them, download them, and use them from around the world. And there'll be a kind of newsflash to friends of Sustainability Frontiers saying, hey, they're now available. We're really happy now to answer or try to respond to your questions, even if those questions take us into our own dark corner. Thank you very much.
And thank you, David and Fumiyo. That was terrific. If you could advance us to the next slide, the question slide where people can enter their questions. I think it's fairly straightforward, folks. Many of you have seen this before, but if you have a question for David or Fumiyo or both, please type it into the box and then that you see on the screen, and then press submit. And I will be going to the back office and retrieving those questions and passing them one at a time to David and Fumiyo for their answers. If you have a second question, hit submit submit the first one first, and then start typing into that blank box that you'll see again on the screen. And I do see a question. The question you're typing in some questions. I will answer the question that Jessica has just asked in the chat box, which is that yes, if you would like a certificate participation, just indicate that. Send me an email after the webinar to tim@greenteacher.com, and I'd be glad to send you one. So I'll repeat that a little bit later as well. So do type your questions into the chat box, into the box on the screen, and I will pass them on to David and Fumiyo. In fact, I'll pause now and see if there are any already. David and Fumiyo, I'm actually having a little trouble on the back office, but I'm seeing through the preview button on the screen here that someone has asked the question, are there ideas on your website for how to make the activities age appropriate? When you know students, you'll want them to do something after learning these issues. Do you have suggestions for action-oriented now what type project?
Yeah. Our website will shortly have a learning activities section to it, which will cover all grade levels. We're actually progressing that at the moment, and it will shortly be available on the website. We're going to have connection through to Green Learning in Canada too, as part of that process. So yeah, we will have a range of activities available for all grade levels. I think some of the activities we've tried tonight, there's been an orientation in this presentation to more senior school because we chose to use our recent UNESCO activities. But for instance, the kind of things Fumiyo was talking about in terms of local surveys and transects and vulnerability assessment. These are things that already we're using in primary level in a range of countries around the world. Some of these activities with a little bit of ingenuity and rebooting already can be used. We use cartoon, we use story a lot with elementary students and middle school students already. But yes, there are a range of activities coming, and we're for all grade levels. We're preparing them, and a lot of them will go up on our website quite soon.
Thanks, David. One person is asking, saying that her students have really developed what she calls climate fatigue. They just don't want to hear about the topic anymore. They feel they can't do anything about it. It depresses them. Do you have suggestions for how to get around that reaction? In other words, if the topic frightens or depresses them, how do you let students feel those feelings without getting stuck in those feelings of depression?
Yeah, I mean, there is a terrible it's a long-standing problem for those who've been working on a range of educations, such as environment education and development education, global education, of the paralyzing effect of gloom and doom and the negative response to gloom and doom. I think that's a perfectly valid and understandable response. I think the question is rather one of taking people through a number of times through a process of confronting an issue and working through feelings with that issue, but then moving to processes which reveal to people how much power, how much skill, how much voice they've got. This is why we had the Joanna Macy Despair and Empowerment activity in the Green Teacher number you mentioned, Tim, in that there we try to take people. You cannot leave people in gloom for too long. You need to ask them to articulate the gloom through their own lens and in their own words, but then take them through processes of, well, how much strength have I got? Have I shown the ability to change things in my life, in my personal life, and with my friends and stuff so far? And now, can I take this further, and can I direct it to the issue of climate change? So I do think there are strategies. There are ways a teacher can facilitate learners through processes which slowly but surely enable them to see their ability for what we call blessed unrest.
Great, thank you, David.
Sorry, Tim. Another thing I would say is that in terms of the cosmopolitan dialogue we talked about, I think it's really important that young people engage with young people in different parts of the world and share their action stories, their successes, and so on and so forth around climate change. There are some wonderful things being done by young people in all parts of the world. Passing over to Fumiyo at this stage.
Just adding to David's last point, there are organizations, NGO like Plan International. They made a web-based communication tool where young people in the developed countries and developing countries can communicate each other. So they are in the same age group, right? So their experience really stimulate each other's experiences. I think that would be the real. There are a lot of real opportunity where students can be motivated in the discussion.
Okay, Tim.
Terrific.
Another question?
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you both. We're getting lots of questions really related to the whole point about how to avoid getting overwhelmed by climate change concepts, how to really both understand the realities and their implications, but be prepared to be active citizens in reducing the causes of the factors that contribute to climate change. And so one person saying, how do you finish on these higher notes, these action notes?
Oh, okay. How do you finish on a higher note? I think it's a question of determining progressively theatres for action. What we have done with our disaster risk reduction work is when we're trying to teach children to become leaders in their community in vulnerability assessment. Well, what we've done there is that, so with the first few grade levels, the children are trained in vulnerability assessments within their own family. By the latter parts of the elementary stage, they're working on vulnerability assessments of their own school, working with the principal, the folk who live there, the janitors, whoever it is, and working a thoroughgoing vulnerability assessment. And that turns by adolescent stage, when we're into the higher grades, into conducting and leading a fully fledged vulnerability assessment involving members, parents and members of the community. So in a sense, a higher note is, it's not so much just one high note, but locating areas where students can, as it were, flex their arms, try and achieve some success, feel stronger from that success, and then kind of tranching the whole thing upwards bit by bit. So that I think is part of it. The high note of giving people a good sense of, we had a tough thing here to do, and we worked our way through it, and we achieved something, and we've done something for ourselves and our community. And okay, then we graduate it. We take it out to become even more to different spatial levels, if you like. So that's the kind of thing to do. You can have high notes through. Fumiyo talked about the importance of story. We've collected 2 disaster risk reduction and climate change education success stories involving children, and the sharing of those and the inspiration that can come from those can be very powerful. So there's the peer role modeling, success stories within appropriate spatial contexts, even simulating reality in the classroom and taking people through a process of engaging with a simulated problematic. Or there are many ways to inject a positive note, if not a higher note, into the whole process. Fumiyo, do you want to say anything? Okay. Yeah. Cheers. Okay.
Okay. Thank you again, both of you. Another question, David, you mentioned when you were elaborating on the different elements of what a deep climate change education would look like. You mentioned the need to confront the notion of economic growth and consumerism. Do you have some examples of activities that could help those on this webinar to raise those issues with kids?
There are 1 or 2 long-standing simulation games that are still available, such as, I think it was called Star Power quite a bit ago. But overall, this is a thin area. We've worked out a number of group discussion exercises around climate change, but what the whole field is really in need of are some new experiential units and new simulations looking at growth. What we've seen happening so far with children, and certainly this has happened in the southwest of England here, is children experimenting with local barter economies, creating a non-growth coinage and going through exchange and bartering in their own areas. We've seen students also, primary, elementary and secondary, being taken out to work with alternative communities in Devon and Cornwall and the southwest of England, having work experience there, going on research visits and field visits there, and talking to people who day to day are trying to struggle with this whole issue of detaching themselves from the growth economy. But I think it's a really big area that needs looking at a lot more. We're pretty sure it's a vital area. We're also pretty sure there's still a lot of space for appropriate materials, and in the climate change handbook we're looking at, we're working on developing those. Incidentally, we should say that with the link with Green Learning, and Bert talks online, and he knows about this from Halifax, we're going to set up a discrete place on the Green Learning website, linked to our own website, where teachers who want can have who sign an agreement to field test with us. They can actually field test some of these new ideas we're currently developing. So that's something you can approach Green Learning or approach us if you're interested in your own classrooms trying some of the new activities we're working on presently.
Thank you, David. And I see, Meg, you've kindly shared with us the greenlearning.ca URL in the chat box. That's great. I'm going to actually suggest, David and Fumiyo, we sort of take a break here and actually put up the end of session evaluation. Those who still want to ask questions, please hang around. It'll take us 60 seconds, 90 seconds for the evaluation. But because we did start late, there will be, David and Fumiyo and I are all happy to stay and answer any more questions that you do have. But recognize that lots of people some of you will need to leave, and I'd like to give everybody a chance to fill out the evaluation. So in just a moment, I'll click that and put that on the screen, and as an incentive to fill out the 5 questions. It's not that one. I'll grab it. It's okay. There we go. As an incentive for those of you with us still, if you can to fill out these 5 questions, 3 or 4 of which are multiple choice questions, and I see a typo in the last part of the first question there. But in any case, 2 people who take the time to fill out this questionnaire will be eligible to win. Will win rather a 1-year free subscription to Green Teacher. We'll do that selection in a couple of days. So just do take a moment, and while you're filling those out, I will just answer one other question that got posed again. The 2 questions that have been posed to me in the chat box. One is, will this presentation be available for those who came late? A couple of you came late to it. The answer is yes. The archive we'll open the archive actually probably later tonight and send everybody a link to it tomorrow. There's a lot of people who signed up. Typically, lots of people sign up for the webinars and view them in the week afterwards, and so we'll send out the URL so that everybody can access that. And again, if you'd like a certificate of participation, just send me an email after the session to tim@greenteacher.com, and I'd be glad to do that. So David and Fumiyo, while we're leaving this up on the screen for maybe another 30 seconds, I'm happy to turn it back to you for any other comments or thoughts.
Yeah, I'm interested in the chat box, Tim, in that 1 or 2 folk are kindly proposing some other ways into the growth issue with some good Canadian initiatives and materials that we weren't aware of, and that's great. So if folk are interested, they can find some more ideas there, including reference to Green Learning.
There's another, by the way, if someone were to ask me about curricula for critiquing traditional models of economic growth, I would have to say in the 20 years I've been doing Green Teacher, I've seen they are few and far between. There's not much, but there is quite a bit of good stuff that critiques consumerism, and some of the best stuff I've seen has been done by a group out of Seattle called Facing the Future. And most of their curricula is free and downloadable, and they have done probably 24 curricula that most of which is freely available on their website, and some of which worked with early primary or early elementary level, as well as the more obvious middle school and high school level. So that's another organization to have a look at. David, if I could have you go back and put up the last slide again for questions. I think we've given everybody enough time to finish the questionnaire. I do apologize. There's always a couple of people who will not have finished the questionnaire. And by the time, and I probably should have given you, I do apologize, I should have given you a 10-second warning, and I didn't do that. So my bad. There will be another opportunity to do that tomorrow when I send out the email to everyone. So again, my apologies if I cut you off there. If you do have an additional question, feel free to type it into the chat box or onto the screen. It's faster at this point to put it in the chat box, and but either way, we'll look forward to receiving it and answering it.
How many people now?
Well, while we're waiting, I do have a question for you. When is this teacher book on climate change education coming out?
Well, it'll be pretty much written this year. We're in discussion with Green Learning about it being published very quickly as a joint Sustainability Frontiers Green Learning ebook. If that happens, it could well be out within 2012. If we went the kind of hard copy book route, it'd be obviously something like, I'd guess, summer of 2013. But we're in active negotiation at the moment. Our two organisations are forming a close alliance. Sustainability Frontiers Canada out of Halifax ourselves, and Green Learning, and also UNICEF Toronto are forming a kind of close alliance on climate change issues, and all the organisations I've just mentioned are interested in the idea of electronic publishing to get stuff to teachers the quicker.
Excellent. I've got a couple more questions for you. By the way, I'm on the board of Green Learning. I guess I'll hear about that the next board meeting.
Sorry,
but
I've spoken out
no,
of
that's
turn.
great. No, that's totally fine. I'm delighted. A couple of questions. One was one just a curiosity question. Have you what kind of settings do you normally do your presentations? Can maybe describe some of the workshops you've done recently?
Well, we do. The answer to that is wherever we're asked, really. We might be asked here locally in Sidmouth to do something for a group of teachers, or in Devon, local educational authority or school board workshops. We do. They can be of various durations. We do workshops for the UN, for international non-governmental organisations, a range of possibilities. We tend, rather than, because we often do a lot of consultancy work, we're not setting up beyond our summer institute much of a program ourselves, but we're highly responsive to people who say, hey, will you come and do a day workshop, a weekend workshop, a 5-day workshop for us, or if it's not too distant, a 2-hour workshop, though we prefer longer, frankly. The website has a section on the things we've done recently, if folk want to look.
Great.
Fumiyo wants to say something on this.
Please do.
Yeah, just to repeating what David said. But our website has a section regarding what we can offer. So we are happy to negotiate if you're interested in our work, and we can tailor-made program upon request.
Great. Another sort of related question is, you've been producing materials for David, of course, for many, many years, and you, Fumiyo, with David together now for a little while. The other related question is, what are the typical settings in which your materials are used? In other words, not when you're leading a workshop, but rather the published materials that you've, where are they normally used?
A lot of our handbooks have taken the form of activities, either activity style organized or thematically organized, and basically, as we understand it, they're used by teachers in the classroom, not as a sort of complete program, but taking activities as deemed appropriate and relevant to what they're doing and pulling those into the program. We haven't done so much by way of here's a complete learning program, go through it A, B, C, D, E, F, G. We rather develop things conceptually and then leave it as much flexibility for teachers to use our materials as and when they think it's appropriate, to using their own discernment.
Okay, and here's the last question, I guess, for the evening. Before you guys head out to look for those northern lights. And the question is, and it's a big one actually, and it says, there's so many climate change issues. It's really an umbrella topic, and you've really quite nicely, really reminded us how it's connected to really some other really major topics that often don't get addressed very well. But the person's asking, given how many climate change topics there are, where do you recommend that people start?
Well, we would favour, and those folk who want to get hold of our UNICEF materials that are coming out on climate change and disaster risk reduction, we deal with this. We firstly say, horizontally, climate change should be and disaster risk reduction should be treated across the curriculum. There should be horizontal integration of climate change across many subjects. And one of the big beefs we've raised tonight is that it being, as it were, marshalled into science and technology curriculum in particular. But more specifically answering the question, our view is that there needs to be vertical integration of climate change and disaster risk reduction education, meaning that we look at what's appropriate at grade 1, what's appropriate at grade 2, grade 3, and so on, and throughout. So our answer is, right from the start of formal schooling, these issues should be dealt with. But you might say, well, climate change is too esoteric for a 5-year-old or 6-year-old. They can't deal with that, and of course we'd entirely agree with that. But we work with this notion of foreshadowing. Are there ways of foreshadowing the concepts and ideas that might become important with greater maturation, say grade 5, 4 and 5, that in simple ways the ground can be prepared for by doing simple but helpful and useful things with grade 1, 2, 3 and so on. So we like that idea very much. A very simple example of foreshadowing would be that, say by grade 5, 6, it's very easy, 4 even, it's not so difficult to get across the notion of interdependence. Certainly by grade 5, that's achievable, and through the upper elementary years into lower secondary. But you can foreshadow a conceptual understanding of interdependence by forms of cooperative learning from grade 1 onwards, because the dynamics of cooperation are the dynamics of interdependence. So that's an example of what we mean by foreshadowing. So, and I think we can foreshadow aspects of climate change issues, aspects of disaster risk, right from grade 1, and we're working with UNICEF and UNESCO on trying to do that.
Fantastic. And again, a hearty thanks to both of you for doing this evening. I know that this is going to be an archive. The archive version starting tomorrow will be much visited, and I really appreciate the time and effort you've put into not just putting together this presentation, but also the thoughtful answers that you've provided to the questions posed to you after your presentation. If you can hit the archive button, we'll turn off the archive. We can still chat, and
Well,
we'll be.
We'll just say goodbye to everybody.
Thank you very much. So thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
And from me too. Thanks for listening to us, and goodbye, and lots of love to Canada and North America. Take care.
And Karen's Australia tonight. Yes.
Oh, and Australia too. Even that's great.
And Puerto Rico. I forgot Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico's there too. Great. Anyway, best to everybody, and thank you.